Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to learn how we can use Flask logic, object-oriented programming, multiprocessing and AJAX to create a number generator that will generate and sum numbers per process all at the same time. Okay, so I have created a new folder called Multiprocess and I've opened it in my Visual Studio Code and in my terminal. So the first thing we're going to do is just create a virtual environment, so Python 3-m venv, and then we'll call it myenv. Then once this is done, we're just going to do source myenv bin activate. And now that we have myenv at the start of this, we are just going to say pip3 install Flask, and that's going to install everything that we need to get started with our Flask app. So inside of this, we will just create a couple of folders. We'll create one called app, we'll create another called templates, and then inside of the app, we are going to create an __ init.py, and that will just be the initializer for the app. So in here, we will just say from Flask, import Flask. And we're also going to import OS so that we can handle some templates. So we'll say app is equal to Flask, and then we'll say name. And we're going to say template folder is equal to os.path.join. And then inside of this, we're going to say os.path.directory name, and then for the specific file that we're using. And we're just going to use the 2 full stops to go back a directory, and then we will say templates. So essentially, when this is run, it's going to join all of the file path that it's using. It's then going to go back a name, so back into this multiprocess folder, and it will look for the templates folder. So this is then going to direct our templates to this folder because our init file is actually inside of this app. So now we need to also do the same for the static folder. So we'll say os.path.join, and then os.path.directory name, file, pass in the 2 full stops, and we'll also pass in static. I'll put that onto a new line so it's easier to read. And then we need to actually pass in our roots, but we're only going to initialize this app when it's called, so we'll actually be calling this from another file. So if we create a function just to make sure that it gets called once, so we'll say def create app, and then we'll put all of this inside of this function. So we'll say from.roots, so this is going to be looking for a file inside this app called roots, and we'll just import main. And then we're going to say app.register blueprint, and we'll say main, and then we're just going to return the app. So now inside this app, we will create a new one called roots.py. And here we are just going to create a simple root, but we need to make sure we have imported everything we need from Flask. So we'll say from Flask, import blueprint, render template, JSONify, and request. And then we are going to actually make a blueprint of the app because we are creating the app here. So when we are registering the blueprint, this is then going to use a function or the blueprint that we are creating here. So we'll say main is equal to blueprint, and then we'll say main, and we'll pass in the name. And then here we'll just create a decorator for the main function. So main.root, and then we'll pass in a / and we'll just say def index, and we're just going to return render template of the index.html. And now if we come over to our templates and we just create an index.html, and we create a HTML5 boilerplate, and then in here we are going to use two CDNs, one for jQuery and one for Tailwind, but we'll give it a title, so multiprocessing example. And then, so we're going to link to Tailwind CDN, so https cdn.jsdeliver.net/npm/Tailwind CSS, and then we'll use at 2.2.19, and we're going to say dist tailwind.min.css. And then we also need to get the jQuery library. So we will say script and then source https://code jQuery.com, and then we're just going to get 3.6.0.min.js. So now we have a link to Tailwind and a link to jQuery. We can actually use them inside of here. So just to make sure that it's working, we will create a couple of classes for the body tags. We'll say bggray100 and textgray800, and then we'll create a heading one that just says hello world. So now we have our roots and our initialization method sorted. We need a way to actually run this app. So outside of all of these, in the root directory, we just create a run.py, and then inside of here we're going to say from app import create app. We'll say app is equal to create app, and then we'll just say if name double equal to main app.run, and then debug is equal to true. So now if we come over to our terminal and we say Python 3 run.py, we should have a working development server start. And then if we come over to Google Chrome, we have hello world, and we can make sure that the colors are actually being pulled in. So we have our Tailwind colors. So Tailwind is in and working correctly, which is good. So now we actually want to create a class or a file that will hold our class, and this is going to be our worker. So it's essentially going to take in two numbers, one that will be for the number of processes that is happening concurrently, and one is going to be for the number of numbers generated for each process. So for instance, if we have two processes running at the same time, the first process might get two random numbers of 12 and 24, so the sum of that would be 36. So then the second process would have 18 and 34, for example, so the sum of that would be 52. And what we're actually going to do is just output the total of both processes. So if we took that, then it would be 88, for example. So inside our app, we'll create a worker.py, and then we are just going to use the multiprocessing library. So we'll say from multiprocessing, import process and queue. So queue is a data type, or a data structure, sorry. And then we will import random, and we're just going to create a class for the worker. So we'll say class worker, and we're going to create initialization method, so we can pass in self, and then the number of processes and the numbers per process. And then here we'll say self.number of processes is equal to number of processes, and then self.numbers is equal to numbers per process. So now we need to create a function that is actually going to generate random numbers. So we'll say def generate numbers. Need to pass in self so that we have access to the parameters up here. We also want to pass in count and the queue. So we say numbers is equal to, and then in square brackets, because we're going to use list comprehension, so we'll say random.randint, between 1 and 100. And then we'll say for underscore in range count. So for, say we pass in 4, for 4 iterations we are just going to create a random number between 1 and 100 and store it all inside of a list. And we'll say total is equal to sum of numbers, and then we're just going to say q.put total. So this is going to store the total inside of a queue. We'll then say def run, pass in self. We'll say q is equal to an instantiation of the queue that we passed in. We'll then say processes is equal to an empty list. And we'll say for underscore in range self.number of processes. So if we have 2 processes, they will both run concurrently, side by side. So here we need to then use the process class. So we'll say process target is equal to self.generate numbers, which is this function here. And then we'll say args self.numbers per process and the queue. And then we'll say process.start. And then we are going to actually append the process that we receive back inside of our processes up here. So we'll say processes.append and then process. And then we want to loop through the processes that we have just appended into that list and join them all together. So we'll say for process in processes, process.join. Because this is a list, we can use the .join method. And then at the end, we'll say total sum is equal to sum of q.get. And then we'll say for underscore in range self.number of processes. And then we are going to just return the total sum. So this will actually loop through all of the queues that we have, or the numbers that we've added into the queue, and then total them up, and then return that as a number to our index.html file, but using a JavaScript function for AJAX, which we need to create a static folder for. And then inside that, we will just say scripts.js. Okay. So now if we come back over to our roots, we have obviously a way to have for a user to put in some data, but we don't actually have a way to process any data. So we need to create a route for a process. So if we come to here and we say @main, we'll pass in the process route. And we're going to make this a post request. So we'll say def process, and then we'll say number of processes is equal to an integer. So we need to make sure that it is an integer. Request.form.get, and then we'll say num underscore processes, and this is just going to be the name of a input field. And then we will say numbers per process, and this will be the same. So request.form.get numbers per process. We'll pass in 5. So these will be default values. So if nothing's given, then it will be a 2 and a 5. So we'll have 2 processes that run concurrently and 5 random numbers that are generated per process. And then we'll say worker is equal to the worker class. So up here, we will need to say from.worker because this is within the same directory. So from.worker import worker. And then here, when we initialize the worker, we need to pass in our processes. So num processes, and then numbers per process. and then we'll say result is equal to worker.run. So this is initializing and then running. And whilst it's running, it's then going to be using this generate numbers as it goes. Okay, so we have our routes almost sorted. We just need to return a JSONify of the result, so we can actually use this result variable in our JavaScript, which will then be passed into our index.html. So now if we come back over to our HTML, we can remove this heading 1 and we'll say div.container.mxauto, px4 and py of 8. So this is going to create a container that's centralized with a padding on each side of 1 rem and a padding on top and bottom of 2 rem. And then inside of this we'll say heading 1 with a class of text 3L, font bold, margin bottom of a rem and a half, and then we're just going to centralize it. And then we'll say multiprocessing example, and we'll create a form with an ID of process form that has a white background, a medium shadow, rounded corners, and then padding on the right and left of 2 rem, padding top of a rem and a half, padding bottom of 2 rem, and then a margin bottom of 1 rem. So now the action we will leave because we'll pass in the action when we actually call or when we submit the function, submit the form, and that will be done using an AJAX request. So here we'll say div margin bottom, and then a label with display block, text of grey 700, text small, font bold, and half a margin. So for num processes, and then inside this we will just say number of processes, and then an input that is type of number. We're going to say the ID is, sorry, the name is num processes, the ID is also num processes. We'll say the minimum is 1 and the value is 2, so this will be default 2. And then if we give it a little bit of Tailwind classes, so we'll say shadow, appearance none, border, rounded. If I put this all onto a new line so it wraps, and we'll say width full, py2 px3, text grey 700, leading, which is the letter spacing, so that will be tighter. And then when it's focused, we want to use an outline of none, and then we will give it a shadow of outline. So when it's focused, then we will reset the outline and then we'll give it a shadow. Next we'll come down and we'll do the number of processes. So this will be exactly the same input form. So I'm going to copy this and paste. We will change this from number of processes to say numbers per process. And then here the 4 will be numbers per process. And then if we copy this, so we'll change the name and the ID to be numbers per process to match this 4. And then the classes will all be the same, so they will be exactly the same styled input fields, but we'll change the min and the value. So the min will be 1 and the value will be 5. So by default, when you first get there, it will be 5, which is good because when we're on here, we have set 2 and 5. So if you come there and you just press the submit button, by default, it will have 2 and 5, which is good user experience. So next we want to have a button that will just essentially start the process. So we say div flex, item center and justify between. So that's going to assign display flex, align item center and justify space between. So it will be basically centered. We will create a button that has a class of bg blue 500, and when it's hovered we will say bg blue 700. We're going to say text white and font bold. We'll say py2 and px4, and then we'll give it rounded as well. We're going to say focus outline none and focus shadow outline. And we're going to say type is equal to submit. And then inside of this button, we're just going to say start processing. So now outside of this form, we need a way to actually display the results. So what we'll do down here is we'll have a div with an ID of result that has a class of margin top 6 and text center. And then inside of this, we'll have a p tag that is text large and font semi-bold. We'll say total sum, and then we'll create a span that has an ID of total sum. And we'll leave it as just a dash because when you first get there isn't actually going to be any sum generated until you click start processing, and then that will change depending on the result that's returned. So now, so that we can get our scripts to work, at the bottom, but inside of our body, we need to link to our scripts. So we'll say URL 4, and then inside of this, static, and we'll say the file name scripts.js. So this will match the JavaScript file that we created a moment ago. And now, just to make sure that we have everything working still, if we come over to Google Chrome and we refresh, we have, that should be font white. I spelled white wrong. We have a styled form using Tailwind, and we can change these. However, if we press something, it doesn't actually do anything currently because we haven't got a way to direct these numbers that are passed in this query string to our process route. So now if we come back to our scripts, and if we start by saying $ and then document, and we'll say .ready. So this will just make sure that the document is ready and fully loaded before any of our JavaScript pulls in, because it could cause some errors. So then we are going to target the process form, and we'll say .on submit. And then we're going to create a function, and we'll pass in the event, so the on-click event. And we'll say event.prevent default. This will just stop the form from submitting, because when you submit a form, by default, the page refreshes. It's just the way browsers work. So if we stop this from happening, then we can have the AJAX request run in the background, grab the data, and then output it in the front end, all without actually refreshing the page, because when you refresh the page, you lose the data that you retrieve back. So we'll say $.ajax, and then in here we need to create a JSON variable, and we are going to just say type, and this will be post. So this is the post function, which will match up to this process, the method of being post. We'll say URL /process, and then we'll say data. And we're just going to say this, which is referencing this form. So this dot serialize. It's a difficult word to spell. And then we're going to say success. So when this is a successful AJAX call, we're just going to create a function that passes in the data that we are getting back. So this will be this returned JSON. And then inside of here, we're just going to say $total_sum.text. So we're going to add some text to the total sum. And then we'll say data.result. So we are getting the result object that's passed back from the data. And then we are going to be outputting it inside of this span down here. So now if we come back over to Google Chrome and we refresh and then change this, so we have 3 processes and 5 numbers per process. If I press start processing, we have a total sum of 850. And if we do it again, because these are random numbers, they should change every time. But if we move it down to 2 numbers of process and we generate some more numbers, we are constantly receiving new numbers and we are being able to do them both concurrently or within a couple of seconds. Hopefully this has helped you grasp how we can use object-oriented programming, multiprocessing, and AJAX to concurrently run 2 functions at once, allowing for much more flexibility and handling larger workloads more efficiently. If you learned something today, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to see new videos coming. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon.